Why do so many people over 60 walk into a room, stop completely, and have absolutely no idea why they came in? And what does that moment have to do with the earliest detectable warning sign of dementia that neurologists are now watching more carefully than almost anything else? That question sat with me for a long time before I understood its full significance, because most people, when that happens to them, laugh it off. They call it a senior moment. They attribute it to tiredness, to distraction, to the ordinary business of a full life. And sometimes that is exactly what it is. But sometimes, and this is the part that keeps neurologists like myself awake at night, it is something else entirely. It is the brain sending a signal that has been misread, minimized, and dismissed for so long that by the time anyone takes it seriously, the window for meaningful intervention has quietly closed. There is one specific sign that the research now identifies as the earliest, most consistent, most frequently ignored warning of cognitive decline in adults over 60. It does not look the way most people expect dementia to look. It does not announce itself dramatically. It arrives quietly, gradually, woven so naturally into the texture of everyday life that the people closest to you may notice it before you do, if anyone notices it at all. I am Dr. Arthur Bennett, and I have spent over 2 decades studying the neurology of aging and cognitive decline. What I'm going to walk you through today is what this warning sign actually is, why your brain produces it, what it means at a biological level, and most importantly, what you can do right now, today, to respond to it intelligently and protectively. Stay with me. Every word of this is something I genuinely wish more people knew far earlier than they typically do. There is a reason this particular warning sign gets missed so consistently, and understanding that reason is the first step towards seeing it clearly. We live in a culture that has taught us to think about dementia as a condition that arrives fully formed, a dramatic, unmistakable shift in personality and memory that everyone in the room recognizes immediately. The movies have shaped this expectation. The news stories reinforce it. And so when the earliest signs appear, subtle, quiet, easy to rationalize, neither the person experiencing them nor the people who love them have any framework for recognizing what they are actually seeing. Here is what the neuroscience actually shows, and it is both more nuanced and more hopeful than the conventional picture. Dementia does not begin in the memory centers of the brain. That is not where the earliest detectable changes occur. According to research from leading neurological institutions, the first measurable disruptions in brain function associated with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia appear in the regions governing something called executive function, the brain's capacity for planning, sequencing, organizing, and managing multiple streams of information simultaneously. Memory loss, the symptom everyone recognizes, comes later. It is downstream from earlier changes that have been running for years. Think of it like a river system. The memory disruptions that eventually become obvious are not the source of the problem. They are what happens far downstream when the upstream damage has gone unaddressed long enough. This upstream damage has a specific signature, a specific pattern of early symptoms that, once you know how to look for them, become visible in ways most people have been looking straight through. As one prominent neurologist recently described it in a research summary, the brain does not fail all at once. It sends distress signals for years before the crisis becomes undeniable. Learning to read those signals is the single most powerful act of cognitive self-protection available to any adult over 60. And the signal I am about to describe is the one the research identifies as arriving first and being missed most often. But before I name it, you need to understand the biology of why it appears, because that understanding is what transforms it from a frightening observation into an actionable one. The numbers tell a story that most people find genuinely difficult to absorb. Health experts estimate that by the time a person receives a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, the neurological changes underlying that diagnosis have typically been developing for 15 to 20 years. Read that again, slowly. 15 to 20 years of silent, progressive change before the diagnosis, which means that for a person diagnosed at 75, the process may have begun in their mid-50s. And here is what that statistic makes undeniably clear. The idea that there is nothing to be done, that cognitive decline is simply an inevitable consequence of aging that announces itself too late for meaningful action, is not supported by the evidence. What the evidence actually shows is that the brain has an extraordinarily long early warning period, a period during which intervention, lifestyle adjustment, and targeted protective measures can meaningfully alter the trajectory. The problem is that during this early warning period, the signals are quiet enough to be missed. When researchers compared groups of adults who went on to develop dementia against those who did not, looking specifically at the decade preceding diagnosis, consistent behavioral and cognitive differences emerged that had been present and measurable years before anyone raised a clinical concern. The most consistent early difference, the one that appeared earliest, most reliably, and across the widest range of participants, was not memory. It was not confusion. It was a specific and gradual change in something so ordinary, so woven into daily life, that the people experiencing it almost universally attributed it to stress, aging, or personality. A few years ago, a long-term study tracking cognitive health in older adults over a 10-year period found that this single early marker predicted later cognitive decline, with a consistency that genuinely startled the researchers involved. And when I tell you what it is, I want you to think carefully and honestly about whether you have noticed it in yourself or in someone you love, because this next part is the reason this conversation matters as much as it does. The number one dementia warning sign most seniors ignore after 60 is a gradual but progressive loss of interest in things that used to bring genuine pleasure and engagement. And I want to be precise about what that means, because this is not sadness. It is not depression, though it can overlap with it. It is something more specific and more neurologically revealing than either. Clinicians call it apathy, and it is critically important to distinguish it from ordinary tiredness or a life phase of quieting down. True neurological apathy, the kind that signals early cognitive disruption, is characterized by a reduction in self-initiated behavior, a diminishing motivation to engage with hobbies, social connections, and activities that were previously a source of energy and meaning, and a gradual narrowing of the person's world that happens so slowly that neither they nor the people around them can identify a clear starting point. Picture this. Think about someone you know over 60 or think about yourself honestly, and ask whether the things that used to generate genuine enthusiasm have quietly lost their pull. The garden that used to be tended with real care, now left. The books that used to be consumed eagerly, now sitting untouched on the nightstand. The social calls that once felt energizing, now increasingly avoided. The projects and plans that once gave shape to the week, now replaced by a more passive routine of watching and waiting. These changes can look like wisdom. They can look like the natural quieting of a busy life. They can look like introversion, and sometimes they are exactly that. But when researchers used neuroimaging to examine the brains of adults displaying this pattern of gradual withdrawal and reduced initiative, they found something sobering and consistent. The apathy was not primarily emotional in origin, it was neurological. It reflected measurable reductions in the activity of the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, the regions responsible for motivation, goal-directed behavior, and the initiation of self-driven action. These are the same regions where early Alzheimer's pathology consistently shows its first measurable footprint. This is not a coincidence. This is a signal. And what comes next is where everything shifts from concern into clarity and action. Now, here is what I need you to understand clearly, because this is the part of the conversation that most people never reach, and it is the most important part by far. Apathy in the context of early cognitive change is not a life sentence. It is a signal, and signals exist to be responded to. The brain, even in the presence of early pathological change, retains a capacity for adaptation, regeneration, and compensation that neuroscience is only beginning to fully appreciate. This capacity is called neuroplasticity, your brain's lifelong ability to form new connections, strengthen existing pathways, and reorganize itself in response to challenge and stimulation. And here is what the research now shows with remarkable consistency. Adults who respond to early apathy with deliberate, structured re-engagement, who actively and consistently challenge the brain, restore social connection, increase physical movement, and address the modifiable contributors to neuroinflammation, demonstrate measurably different cognitive trajectories than those who do not. Let me ask you something honest. When you notice yourself pulling back from things, when you catch yourself choosing the passive option, the familiar routine, the television over the conversation, do you treat that as a signal worth paying attention to? Or do you accept it as the natural shape of life at this age? Because the difference between those two responses, played out daily over months and years, may be one of the most significant factors in determining how your brain ages. I know this sounds like a challenge, and it is, but it is a challenge built entirely on hope A, because every single one of these pathways is within your reach. Let me now be specific. The first response to this warning sign is structured novelty. Your brain requires genuine challenge to maintain the neural connections that underpin cognitive vitality. Not puzzle books, though those have modest value. Real novelty, learning a new skill with your hands, navigating an unfamiliar environment, engaging with ideas outside your existing knowledge base. The second is social re-engagement with intentionality. Research comparing cognitively healthy older adults against those in decline consistently identifies the quality and frequency of meaningful social interaction as one of the most powerful independent protective factors against dementia. Not passive social proximity, genuine, reciprocal, cognitively stimulating conversation and connection. If there is someone in your life over 60 who has been pulling back from the world, I want you to tell me about it in the comments. Describe what you have noticed. I read every single one, and sometimes just naming what you are seeing is the first step toward doing something about it. There is a second layer to this conversation that most videos about dementia warning signs never reach, and I want to make sure you leave today with the complete picture, because apathy does not arise in a vacuum. There are specific, modifiable biological contributors that accelerate the neurological changes underlying it, and addressing these is as important as the behavioral responses I just described. The first is chronic sleep disruption. Your brain has a waste clearance system called the glymphatic network, a series of channels that flush toxic proteins, including beta amyloid and tau, out of brain tissue during deep sleep. These proteins, when they accumulate, are directly associated with the neurological damage underlying Alzheimer's disease. Adults over 60 who consistently get less than 6 hours of sleep, or whose sleep quality is poor due to apnoea, pain, or disrupted circadian rhythm, are significantly impairing this nightly cleaning process. According to research referenced by leading neurological health institutions, even a single night of poor sleep produces measurable increases in beta amyloid accumulation in the brain. Chronic sleep disruption over years creates the neuroinflammatory environment in which early cognitive changes take root and progress. The second modifiable contributor is cardiovascular health. The brain receives 20% of your body's total blood supply despite representing only 2% of its weight. Anything that reduces the quality, consistency, or volume of that blood supply, hypertension, arterial stiffening, unmanaged blood sugar, chronic inflammation, directly compromises the brain's ability to maintain itself. A comparison of adults with well-managed cardiovascular health against those with chronically elevated blood pressure found that the cardiovascular group showed significantly better preservation of white matter integrity, the brain's information highway, into their 70s and 80s. The third contributor is social isolation, which has now been elevated by major research bodies to the status of an independent dementia risk factor comparable in magnitude to smoking. Not loneliness as an emotional experience, but the measurable biological state of reduced social stimulation, which drives neuroinflammation and suppresses the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the protein your brain uses to grow and maintain neural connections. These three contributors, poor sleep, cardiovascular risk, and social isolation, are all things you can begin addressing today. And the combination of behavioral re-engagement with these targeted biological protections creates a genuinely powerful defense. But the most important thing you can take from everything shared here today is something simpler and more human than any protocol. I will share it now, in the final moments of this conversation. Your body has been speaking to you. It speaks in the language of subtle shifts. The morning you noticed the garden did not call to you the way it once did. The evening you chose silence over a phone call you once would have enjoyed, the week that passed without you initiating a single thing that was only for the joy of it. These are not random. These are not simply the shape of a quieter life. They are your brain's earliest, most patient attempt to tell you that something needs your attention. And now, for the first time, you know how to listen. You know that apathy is not a personality shift. It is a neurological signal arising from the prefrontal and anterior cingulate regions where early cognitive change first leaves its mark. You know that the brain has an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and self-repair when given the right conditions: novelty, connection, movement, sleep, and a cardiovascular system that delivers clean, consistent blood supply to every neuron that needs it. You know that a diagnosis 15 or 20 years from now is not inevitable. It is a probability that can be shifted meaningfully and measurably by decisions made in the next weeks and months. Think about the conversations you still want to have, the places you still want to go, the grandchildren you want to remember with perfect clarity, the version of yourself at 80 that is sharp, present, and fully alive to every moment. That version is not a fantasy. It is a biological possibility, one that your choices starting today are either building toward or quietly moving away from. Your brain has been speaking to you. Now you know how to listen. Stay with us. There is so much more I want to share with you. And please, if someone you love is showing signs of pulling back from the world, share this with them today. Understanding what they are experiencing may be the most important gift you ever give them.